It's a pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Davina Durgana is a senior international human rights statistician. She is on the board of directors of Free the Slaves and is also affiliated with Green Templeton College in Oxford. So today, Davina will talk about statistics in the area of modern slavery and focus in particular on challenges around capturing gender aspects that impact measurement of prevalence, as well as statistical modeling of more complex issues, such as getting the understanding of vulnerability to slavery. Okay, over to you, Davina. And just to say, this meeting will be, this webinar will be recorded as announced, and we can collect questions on the chat if you prefer to do that, and also afterwards have maybe 20 minutes to have a Q&A for those just like to speak up. Over to you, Davina.
Sure. Thank you so much, Cora, and thank you all for attending. I really am so honored to be able to do this today. I'm coming off of a year of maternity leave, so this is kind of fun to get back into a lot of this work. And I'm calling in to you guys from Jamaica, from Kingston, Jamaica, where there's now a freedom from slavery forum starting today. So it's we're very happy to have you here. If you do have questions, as Cora mentioned, please feel free to pop them in the chat. And I also really like a collaborative, interactive session. So I'll provide a bit of a context for what we're talking about today. And then as you have questions, I'm more than happy to actually integrate them into the presentation and to have a conversation. So as Cora mentioned, I've spent most of my career trying to measure modern slavery, which, as you know, in applied statistics is incredibly difficult, especially when you're starting on the basis of administrative data. So almost all of our survey methodologies, all of our sampling frames need some kind of basis in administrative data. And this is where one of the biggest gaps we see with gendered issues can really arise. So a lot of times when we're talking about data infrastructure, we are talking about legacy structures that typically haven't been modified or are really not dynamic enough to work with the kinds of issues that we have. So one of the things that I've done, actually the UK Home Office, I've spearheaded this initiative on the national level as well, with multiple systems estimation, which is basically just capture, recapture on administrative data sets to try to estimate modern slavery. In developed countries, this tends to be a very effective way of doing things because our survey methodology really isn't going to penetrate deeply enough into the parts of society where we see this in developed countries, because typically law enforcement is more effective and they're able to kind of push this activity further down. So I'm really very familiar with what administrative data looks like at the national level in lots of countries. I've done this type of MSc work in Romania, Serbia, the Netherlands, lots of different places where there was infrastructure, but the data itself was just really missing a gendered lens. And because of that, and specifically one of the reports that the Walk Free Foundation put out while I was working on leading their statistical research efforts, is about how gendered this problem is in general, how exploitation tends to affect women and children more severely. Situations like the ones that you see highlighted here, the uncontrolled spaces, the places that are already difficult to measure, really have a disproportionate effect on women and children, but also non-gender conforming identities and other people that really aren't captured well in administrative data regardless. So when we're talking about the challenges that we have from gendered data, what we're really talking about is how do we create systems that account for different, data fields that will make tremendous differences when we're looking at policy? How are we more inclusive of the people and the types of populations that we need to capture? And then really, what are the resulting effects on policy? So as a statistician that works specifically in the policy space, I typically begin with the end in mind, and I look at the policy implications and the policy groups that are working on a lot of these issues, and I try to think about what needs to be measured and what needs to be specified. If we don't do that, sometimes we end up with very useful, interesting data, but it loses policy relevance because it's not actually conformed to the ways that a lot of these groups would need to have that information presented. Throughout my career, I've done a lot of work, as I've mentioned, trying to find difficult to find populations. This is one of my favorite slides because it really just shows the wide breadth of work that, of course, the Global Slavery Index continues to do, and of course, all of our work is focused on as we're trying to account for the many people that just don't typically show up in a representative, survey methodology. There's forced conscription and child combatants. Obviously, that's something that's deeply hidden. And in any event, it's happening in war-affected areas, which is typically not something that enumerators are capable or willing to survey in the first place. Another example is illegal logging in the Amazon. This is incredibly lucrative, but also very illegal, and so it's really pushed down. It's very mobile. As many of you know, with sampling frames, you're kind of looking for. You need to set up these camps. You need to, super sample specific areas. But if the temporary logging camps are moving frequently, then that means that you're really not going to have very much luck finding them. Another group that we work with, of course, is deep sea slaves. We've done some work with Greenpeace advocating for deep sea fishing vessels to have their products, their fish, be listed on the U.S. government's prohibited importation lists are called withhold release orders. Basically, they're importation bans on goods that are known to be made with forced and child labor. And deep sea shipping vessels really present some significant challenges. A lot of the times, these deep sea vessels are never physically brought into port for like 7 to 10 years. They have refrigerated frigates that go between the deep sea fishing vessels to port to transport the fish. The people working on those vessels typically are prevented from communicating with each other by having dictionaries and other things prevented. And the types of torture that they're subjected to, drinking salt water, being forced to consume cocaine so that they can work longer hours, it's really egregious. So finding the deep sea fishing slaves is very difficult because not only are they obviously transient and constantly moving, but they're also engaging in environmentally unsound practices. So they're evading detection from those agencies as well. And of course, if they're not coming into port, typically a lot of our surveillance mechanisms will not work. I've also done some significant work in the U.S. I'm American, and so I've had an opportunity to really look at this deeply. And very early in my career, I started looking at urban street gangs in the South Side of Chicago, really specifically looking at how those recruitment mechanisms and the vulnerability of those children related to what we were seeing in terms of forced conscription and child combatants. And to be honest, I saw them to be very similar. There are vacuums of American urban centers where there is no police control. There's no, law enforcement don't feel safe entering those areas. And so for these children, it becomes a survival mechanism to join the urban street gang as a means of protection when, there are interstices in society where that is not possible. I've done a lot of work on international crime, transnational organized crime, and this is a pretty common scenario that in the cases where national governments cannot provide sufficient public services, they can't provide social safety nets, they can't provide legitimate protection. This is often where international criminal groups will flourish because they see a need among the society, and then they provide it. And this is actually, even going back to the origins of organized crime, this is typically how that's done. One of my favorite examples is that, of course, the Italian mafia began as tax collectors. The Italian city-states didn't have the capacity to collect taxes, and so that was kind of where this privatization of state functions led to exploitation. And I think that's something that we need to consider as we look at a globalized economy, that as things are outstripping the capacity of national governments to provide control, to provide order, there is going to be more opportunity for this type of exploitation, which is also just making it more difficult for people like us to find. And then, of course, if you can see, there's irregular migration and refugees. Climate refugees are becoming more of an important population that we need to be really considering. Of course, women and children are displaced from their homes earlier and sooner than many other populations because they just don't have the financial or social safety barriers. And then, of course, there's just governmental collapse. So what we were seeing in Venezuela and along the Colombian and Venezuelan borders, there were just huge upticks in modern slavery, specifically sex trafficking for those vulnerable populations. And I've been able to do a little bit of work in Afghanistan following the withdrawal of the U.S. Military presence there. And a lot of this ended up very similarly, where we were now looking at what we would have called coyotes in the Americas in a very similar context. People smuggling in Afghanistan to get women and children, and specifically those that had any affiliations to the U.S. government, safely out of those areas. So it's very challenging. I think when we're talking though about measurement, one of the real challenges we have is that women and children specifically, when we're and non-gender conforming identities, I think really struggle to be captured in a lot of this data because a lot of our emergency planning doesn't account for them either. So there's another example, of course, of refugee camps where women were trading sex acts for men to help them construct the UN provided tents and living structures. And that was because like they had differentiated skill sets. Like they didn't feel adequately prepared to put up those tents themselves. And so they commodified the one thing that they felt that they could. So I think when we're talking about modern slavery, especially when we're considering the juridical definition of it, when you're thinking about the exchange of sex or labor for goods and services, right? Like for some commercial benefit or some actual benefit, I think we really need to consider, just even from a conflict resolution perspective, how can we be more inclusive and cognizant of the vulnerabilities that we place a lot of these people into? Like when we're thinking about forced conscription and child combatants, that doesn't just happen in a vacuum, right? Like that's happening typically because there are large degrees of orphan children in those populations, or that school is not prioritized for all members of the population, or and in the event of war and conflict, all of the existing social safety nets that the government could have provided typically are halted, and so what's left is what the society can protect and do. And I think one of the interesting things about forced conscription and child combatants in particular is that there's a concerted effort to attack the fiber of a society. There's efforts to have the child combatants, summarily execute people within their own community so that they're further isolated, they feel that they can't return. There's ostracization that's occurring. So I think the traffickers that we're working to find are really very talented at excluding and isolating the segments of the population that they want to exploit. And so we, as people who work in the data and the policy world, need to be cognizant of the types of things that are happening. And that's pretty much what goes on when we're talking about vulnerability modeling. We need to be able to forecast what is going to be contributing to these areas of risk and vulnerability, and to try to preemptively develop policies to prevent that. I mean, in the event of a governmental collapse or an outbreak of conflict, there are still mechanisms where we can provide humanitarian aid or evacuation services, but we need to know where and whom to prioritize. And this is pretty much where I think our type of work in vulnerability modeling can really make a huge difference. I think that this is where we can actually use statistics to save lives. And it's difficult, of course, and I think it requires a lot of like really targeted conversations like the one we're having right now about where our shortcomings are. Because I think when I look at a lot of this data, I'm not seeing a lot of information about various age groups. I'm not seeing a lot of information about minors. And of course, I know that that's very difficult to track, but typically in administrative data sets, that tends to not be as much of a limitation as it is in survey methodologies, for example. So I think we need to just take advantage of the fact that administrative data sets are basically lacking fields of data, that we can just have a template. We can just basically put this information out there and say, it may not be clear to you as the frontline organization helping these people about why we need this information, but the more disaggregated data we can obtain, the more nuanced analyses we can do, especially when it comes to vulnerability modeling. Another thing I want to add about this frontline level of data collection is that I've had a lot of experience working with minors in the US where and just like in England, there are lots of data protection measures in place for minors, as there should be. One of the things that I found working with vulnerable populations is that they, as all of us, tend not to be very objective judges of our own vulnerabilities. And so what that means is that in the instances where I've interviewed or spoken to survivors directly, their interpretation of what contributed to their situations of modern slavery were often different than the perspectives of the people who were providing them the services. So from that perspective, we really need to consider the value, I guess, of direct survey research in terms of asking and even when we ask potential victims or survivors of their experiences, we're typically asking very, as you know, consistent questions that would apply to almost anyone to anyone that we ask. And then the enumerator is the one who's responsible for kind of understanding what's being told to them. So they're selecting the mode of coercion, for example, or force or fraud that's keeping them in that situation. In my experience, especially working with minors where it's very difficult to receive those approvals to talk to them directly, and I'm not sure that it's worth the re-traumatization, I've had really great success working directly with the service providers and asking them to provide their perspective on the vulnerabilities that have contributed to the minors that they're working with. And this has twofold benefits. First, we're not taking the risk of re-traumatizing minors or vulnerable populations for the purposes of research, which is obviously very important. And it's one of the Belmont principles, of course, in terms of ethical research. There's also the concept that, like I said, if they're not good judges of what's contributed to their vulnerability in the first place, then we have an issue and related to the reliability of that data. So for me, when we're talking about this type of research, I think there's something to be said for using expert third parties that have extreme familiarity with the situations and the contexts here to then be able to discuss with them kind of openly and more candidly about the situations that have contributed here. So I've done that with minors in the US to modern slavery. That was the crux of a lot of my dissertation, like one of the models I created for my dissertation project. And it's still to this day one of the best examples I've seen in practice in our field of how to circumvent some of the child protection limitations in our research, but still to get very useful, viable information. I also want to discuss gender nonconforming identities. This is, of course, something super important, I think, as censuses and other administrative data sets are starting to account for these types of variations. I think we can start to see more like standardized data collection practices that'll help us with this. But it is really important to know that these populations are incredibly vulnerable to a lot of the things that are going on. And I wonder, especially for perhaps more antiquated or legacy systems like the ones we may be more familiar with working on, how we can account for these things without introducing the bias itself. So one of the challenges I always have, of course, in cognitive testing any of our survey tools is how much are we leading our research subjects by the questions that we're even asking, right? So even when we have options for drop-down menus, it implies a certain social perspective, a very liberal social perspective, to be inclusive of all of these identities. And that isn't necessarily a problem in general or at all, but it does confer a certain bias, especially coming from Western organizations. And when we're working with certain countries, especially in like East Africa, I'm thinking in places that tend to have more conservative gender roles and ideas about non-conforming sexual identities, that it can be off-putting or perhaps something that biases the types of answers that we get. So I think as we're talking about how to gender mainstream, as the UN has, called it, but how do we change our administrative data infrastructure to account for these things? I do wonder about some of the limitations we have in terms of influencing our research subjects by even including this in the first place. The other thing I want to mention is that there's an amazing report that we put out with Every Woman, Every Child with the UN. It was during COVID in 2020, but it was about specifically how all of our social, educational, and economic systems really disenfranchise women and children in particular, and that contributes to the 71% of women that we were finding as slaves of modern slavery back in 2016, and that as we've improved our measurement efforts, we are just seeing more of a proportion of women involved in this. There are several things that I want to highlight from that. There's the idea that from birth, there are certain cultures, there are certain expectations that having female children is less valuable than having male children. Of course, that is involved with dowries and bride prices, but it's also, for example, in China, when there was a one-child policy, the issue related to if you could only have one child, and then the preference for a male child in that culture was incredibly prevalent. But what that means is now we have a generation of men in China without women of marriageable or childbearing age. And so there's a huge bride trafficking network from the greater Mekong subregion into China, where men basically are purchasing women to be able to have their children and then selling them off because they can't actually afford the price of what those women are being sold for. And it's a social policy issue, but it does lead to further exploitation, further trafficking as we go down the line. There's also an issue with education. If you have children, do you prioritize women or female children or male children for education? Often the perception, and perhaps rightfully so, is that men have traditionally earned more for the same amount of work as women do. That's the same case in Western societies as well. And so typically what will happen is a family may make the astute observation that this is true and prioritize their male children for work, especially because women have the unique role, biological women have the unique role of like being pregnant and having children, physically giving birth. This has naturally caused setbacks in almost all of our careers in some form or fashion. But the principle may stand that the social system, these parents, these families aren't just doing this objectively. They're operating within a context that is well understood, and there is not really a great solution for it. This continues on, of course, as women who also have work and jobs and careers are halted for the actual act of childbirth, for the accommodation of resuming their careers, especially at childbearing ages. And then, of course, as women outlive their husbands, then there's the disinheriting that happens to many widows around the world, and the land tenure rights that perhaps prevent women from taking over their husbands or their communal property land because all ownership may be in the male line. So as we can see, like, there are so many societal and gendered issues at play here that relate to how our data systems will reflect the reality of women and children, and specifically their risk and vulnerability to things like modern slavery. So I think as we're discussing this today, we really need to consider how integrated our broader issues on social policy and gender protections can be, and how we can then capture those changes in a lot of our administrative data sets. So I know that I've been talking for quite a little bit of time, and I was wondering if anyone wanted to kind of transition this to be maybe more of a discussion, if anyone had any questions or statements or things that I've kind of thrown a lot out there, but I didn't know if anyone had any strong reactions to anything and wanted to start our conversation.
nobody else wants to ask anything at this moment, maybe let me just get you to tell us a little bit more about examples of how you've actually tried to do this. It seems to almost to represent unsurmountable challenges in terms of finding some of those populations that you've been talking about that are so extremely mobile and hidden. But yeah, I think it would be very interesting to hear a little bit more about the approaches and how they have, you've been saying that you have tried to improve on the first indices and so on, how that field has developed and what types of approaches have been taken to at least try and address these challenges.
Yeah, thanks, Cora. That's a great question. So there's been a lot, of course, you've been doing this for a very long time. So there's been a lot of developments in the survey tool. We do the cognitive testing. So a lot of times we're really, the focus groups will have a disproportionate number of women and children sometimes, because we want to make sure that we're capturing any kinds of nuance that may be prejudicing or changing how people are defining their experiences, and then therefore having it enumerated. One of the things that we've done is found that the original survey sample, which is typically in partnership with Gallup World Poll for a developed country, is typically a sample size of about 2,000 nationally representative and a stratified sample that follows like a specific enumeration technique for each of like the geographic areas that are chosen based on population. What we've done and typically in situations like this where we know that there's conflict or potentially labor camps or for example, in small scale illegal fishing, we will super sample the areas where we know that those activities might be occurring. For example, when we're talking about border communities, for example, in the United States, there are certain areas where agricultural workers are more likely to be just based on the geography. There's been some work as well out of Nottingham with Kevin Bales and looking at satellite images of India, for example, and finding brick kilns and then concentrating sample sizes based on where those brick kilns can be physically identified and located. The biggest challenge, I think, in obtaining better survey research and data about these populations is understanding the broader context of how to find them when they are hidden. So the satellite imagery work has been relatively difficult with the deep sea slaves because, of course, it's not just identifying the vessels. We can, based on the patterns of the vessels, we can probably predict that slavery may or may not be occurring. But to confirm that, you really need to speak and witness the conditions on board, which makes that very difficult. Brick kilns are a bit more explicit. I mean, like they exist for that purpose, and typically they're not going to have strong labor standards enacted. So we can almost make like more assumptions about that context. Sex work as well has become very difficult to identify, particularly in developed countries, because we're seeing huge amounts of this happening in private homes, not even hotels, not truck stops, not places where there are public spaces and this is interacting. It's typically been very, very difficult. So what we'll try to do is really use our expert knowledge, use survivor knowledge, use any kind of additional information we have to try to increase our ability to find these populations. And the super examples, and even with multiple systems estimation, like we do all kinds of things. We've tried link tracing, which is basically like a sample tracing. It's kind of sometimes it looks more like a snowball sampling methodology where we identify people who have received services for modern slavery, so they've self-identified or been identified, and then we ask them to help us find other populations, or we'll go to like the labor camp populations and inquire about the labor practices and hope that leads us to a bit more of these populations. So it's incredibly challenging. And we almost every time, in every context, in every network, in every country, we have to tailor these results in a way, and tailor our efforts in a way to make sure that we optimize trying to catch as many instances of this as possible. One of the challenges we find, and this might be interesting, is that even in places of conflict, I struggle with this because, of course, I specialize in developed countries, and because our law enforcement tends to be relatively effective at identifying some of these populations, it pushes it further underground. I use this a lot of times as an example in the Netherlands, where um, Amnesty International. I had to go give a talk in Ireland right around the time that Amnesty International published a report claiming that legalizing sex work would improve modern slavery. Well, it would improve the lives of sex workers. But the question was, what would the implication be for survivors of sex slavery? And my finding was that, yes, of course, it would improve the quality of life for sex workers, and that is important anyway. But anytime that you increase or support any kind of industry that typically has the potential for this type of exploitation, and that's not just the sex work industry, it's also cheaply made clothing, it's dangerous mineral mining like coltan in West Africa in the Congo, or cocoa in the West African cocoa plantations, or small scale illegal fishing. um, Basically what you're going to end up seeing is that um, these people are still they're still at risk for all of this exploitation, regardless of the protections that are put in place, because it's been legitimized. So in my opinion, the legalization of sex work does improve the quality of life of sex workers. They're given access to healthcare. They're given access to law enforcement intervention. That's very, very important. But in those instances, modern slavery victims are pushed further underground, because now they're also the competition to the legal sex workers, because modern slavery victims will cater to an audience that doesn't typically have a say in like what they can do. So they can't insist on protection being used, like condoms. Um they can't help resolve any of their issues with violence or abuse or any of those other things. And then there's always like violence fetishes or children, like things that'll never be legal, that can also be provided by modern slavery victims. So the challenge becomes, like, even in developed countries, when there are measures taken to legitimize or bring a lot of these industries into light, there's still always going to be an illicit underground that becomes even more difficult to find in those contexts. So it's more, all of the efforts we've taken has basically been an integration of you know, our social knowledge of the issues and our practical knowledge of the issues, and integration with how we can methodically find it in order to have some kind of replicable or generalizable estimate at the end of the day. So it's kind of, even talking about it now, it's been so interesting because we tailor every single approach to what we know qualitatively and from survivor testimony, and so much more about those issues. So that was a really great question, Cora. And then Leah, I see in the chat you're asking how we define modern slavery. I'm so sorry, I should have started with that. So modern slavery, in its essence, is defined as a condition of work, which it's labor or sex. We consider sex to be an industry of labor, that is provided through force, fraud, or coercion, and provides some kind of commercial or monetary benefit to another. So when we're talking about modern slavery here, there's some confusion, of course, with things like forced marriages. Like, how does that fit into the definition of modern slavery? A forced marriage, though, will fit into that condition of modern slavery, because and let's just say, and it's not always this way, but let's just assume that it's a female being forced into a marriage, which is not always, as I said, the case. There are many heteronormative societies that actually force gay and non-gender conforming biological men into marriages with women as well, to force procreation and other things. But when we're talking about forced marriage, what we're saying is that there's a commercial exchange, typically like a dowry or some kind of financial benefit to the families. And then the woman is providing childbearing, unpaid household labor, lots of different things in exchange for that marriage. So this is kind of like It's a very difficult thing, but typically that's how we defined it, is if someone's defrauded, coerced, or forced into providing sex or labor, and it's typically for commercial benefit to somebody else. And commercial benefit, of course, in the instance of forced marriage, can mean that um, they're providing free labor for something that would otherwise have to be paid for. I do have a lot of resources we can share, and I'll send an email to Cora after this to distribute, if that's okay, Cora, on collecting data and existing data that can be used. The International Conference of Labor Statisticians at the UN, we've been a part of that for a long time, has been doing really great work on this. There was a symposium at something called Code 8.7 with the UN University, where we had an entire discussion on all of those questions, specifically on collecting data and using existing administrative data. And I also have an article in Crime and Delinquency talking about multiple systems estimation and some of the data gaps. So I'll be sure to put all of those things together for Cora so that we can distribute those. Oh, yes, Fiona, please.
Hi, and that's really interesting. I was wondering if wasn't clear what the main, well, I feel from what you're talking about, the main question you're trying to address is get estimates of the number of people involved in these different, in modern slavery in various ways. But is that the only question you're trying to address, or are you also trying to look at sort of trends and making comparative things where it wouldn't be so crucial to get that absolute estimate, and therefore that opens up a much wider range of methods and things that you can do? I just wondered if you could maybe say a bit about that.
Yeah, thank you, Fiona. That's a great question. So absolutely, the absolute numbers are not our only priority. And as you can imagine from a policy perspective, the absolute numbers are useful. Like, they're so interesting to media. They always grab on to our big number takeaways, like 40 million, 50 million slaves. Like, that's the number. But as you and I know, from a practical perspective, that scale of slavery really doesn't change much in terms of our actual work. What I found to be more useful, of course, I'm a risk modeler, so I look mostly at the vulnerabilities. I really enjoy using the data that we find on prevalence to try to inform some of the other risk factors, to basically not fact check, but to validate some of the risk factors that we know from the literature, qualitatively from expert input, and to quantitatively be able to demonstrate, look, there are strong associations in this very small population, in this very small trend we're finding, between these risk factors that I can obtain, that I can, quantify based on administrative data, to the prevalence data that we're finding. You're absolutely right. The absolute numbers, in my opinion, and this is me speaking for me, not for any organization, but the absolute numbers have not been as useful, although they tend to galvanize policymakers in a very interesting way. The more interesting information really comes from like the changes in time, the trends that we're seeing, and what I can associate with objective administrative data from like other known risk factors. I think one of the things that I found most interesting was, especially my colleague Kevin Bales has a book called Blood and Earth, and it's about the impacts of environmental degradation and modern slavery, basically on modern slavery, on environmental degradation, basically that if you don't care about human rights, you don't care about environmental rights, and like these things there's a comorbidity there. I think one of the things that's so fascinating is that like that type of association has been so compelling because there are huge activist groups related to environment, and there's also huge activist groups related to human rights. And I think having data that can tie these things together really changes how effective we can be. I think there's also an interesting component here about what we call my background's, of course, in like security and transnational organized crime, and philosophically speaking. And one of the things that's interesting there is about what we call the securitization of human rights interests. And it's basically that, our military industrial complex is strong that if you can tie, even nebulously, any of these human rights issues, which are generally considered softer social issues, to a hard, security directive, then you actually can achieve a lot more, not just like resources and other things, but you can achieve a lot more policy attention on addressing those issues. So, to your point, the absolute numbers, in my opinion, are probably the least interesting outcome for us as statisticians. I think it's important from a policy perspective. It's important from a media perspective, but I really enjoy using that data, and particularly disaggregated data, to then try to validate some of the other vulnerability trends that we have, because that's where the preemptive area of our science is. It's about us being able to predict what's causing this risk to these populations, and then formulating the appropriate levels of intervention specifically related to those. So for me, I think that that's probably, to your question, where I really look at this data, is that, there's so many pieces here. Like, one of the most interesting takeaways from our global data set a few years ago was actually what was the condition of forced fraud and coercion that kept you in modern slavery. And it was like overwhelmingly the response was unpaid wages. So a lot of people were staying in conditions of modern slavery because they were hoping, and remember, modern slavery meaning that they were accruing greater unpaid wage debt, right? Like, these people owed them more and more money, but they stayed because of the money that they already owed. It was like a sunken cost fallacy kind of thing, that they just kept thinking, like, I'll stay here and maybe get paid, but I'll continue accruing more unpaid wages. So it was an interesting thing, because that's like a policy action that we can take. We can make sure that people, and even just making sure that vulnerable workers are aware of that. Like, look, many of you are staying in situations of modern slavery because of this whole issue related to wage. Like, if you are in this position of believing that you're staying in a condition of modern slavery for the purposes of recouping these wages, know that there are millions of you who believe this, and it's not happening. So even findings like that have been really helpful in terms of, like, some of our messaging and some of our policy dynamics, which kind of brings us to Diana's question about examples of where statistics changed policy or created action groups. The action group thing, like, that kind of happens for every subset or population we work in. There's several UN groups that we're a part of. There are several we created. I led this group at the University of Edinburgh that really examined, after a series of countries that I'd worked in, really examined the multiple systems estimation and how we're working on modern slavery. It's basically the state of the art type of thing for our community. One of my favorite examples of a success, though, where our statistics changed policy, was actually the deep sea slaves. So as I mentioned before, they're very difficult to find. We'd had to use, like, radar, satellite imaging, some very risky like interviews, often at ports, and it's very difficult to get on those ships. But our knowledge of this network and our ability to try to triangulate which vessels may be implicated, what countries were operating this way. There's a lot of offshore fishing and maritime law components and incorporated in that. But basically, the research that we did on the deep sea fishing created the basis for the U.S. government, the Department of Labor, to add these deep sea fishing products from China and Taiwan and Japan onto their list of prohibited goods. And overnight, that meant that thousands, tens of thousands of these vessels stopped operating, because if they couldn't export those goods to America, they had to address the modern slavery issues that they had. Otherwise, they were losing their market share. And functionally, I think that's where the biggest impact for any of us will be, is the impact on our capitalist society's bottom line. So, I mean, at the end of the day, these people aren't trafficking humans because they specifically want to do that. They're trafficking humans because there's the least amount of punitive risk involved, and because it's the most lucrative. So low risk, high reward, right? Like, that's pretty much like the tenet of most illegal activity. So in this case, we made this deep sea fishing issue, this industry for Taiwan, Japan, and China, we made it incredibly high risk and low reward. And because of that, just by flipping that dynamic with the policy that we were able to enact based on our data, overnight, we were able to overhaul a huge part of that industry. And imagine what that meant for the lives of the people that were on those boats, some of them for like 10 years. And now they're being brought back to shore. They're given a chance to, like, leave the ships, to be able to, as they had to just from the bottom up fix this. And the European Parliament has also just passed a modern slavery bill looking at the corporate side, at like, companies that are complicit in modern slavery. And the U.S. government has a few executive orders from the Obama administration that deal with contractors that are implicated with modern slavery. So actually, I think there's just a tremendous opportunity here to really work on our statistics, not just going for the public policy and the social protections and the things that will prevent further instances of modern slavery by protecting vulnerable populations. It's very important. But we're really seeing a huge impact for the bottom line, because at the end of the day, these people are providing services. They're producing goods cheaply. They're providing sex for certain industries. Like, I think as we're looking at this, a lot of positive change will happen once we make modern slavery just too low of a reward for the people that are currently benefiting. So I hope that answers your question, Diana. Oh, Ruth is here. Hi, Ruth. I didn't see you. She was part of that group at Edinburgh.
Hi, Davina.
Yeah, do you have anything you want to add, Ruth, about your experiences working in that group with us? I mean, you did some great work.
I think I was just going to add that I think it's really, really important to get the different people together. So it can't just be statisticians doing this. You need the policymakers, you need the people, the criminologists, you need all the different aspects to understand, because it's so complicated. I mean, and I think that is really demonstrated by the question, what is modern day slavery? Actually answering that in itself is so hard. So how can you then get data and so on without even understanding those basic principles? So I think it really is the interdisciplinary, or the new phrase I'm hearing is transdisciplinary, where everyone is at every part of it, from the data collection to the analysis to the interpretation, specifying the hypotheses that everyone, all these different disciplines are involved at all the different stages.
Yeah, I like that. Transdisciplinary. But Ruth, your leadership too at that University of Edinburgh component, like especially putting together that special edition, it was so helpful, because as Ruth mentioned, we really took experts in our fields from different places, but a huge part of it was the application of like the public health dynamic. It was how we've applied this in different places, and then what that meant for modern slavery. So it is you're absolutely right that collaboration is so critical. And at the end of the day, we're still testing hypotheses that are largely untested. So it's still bringing that expert knowledge into how we can adapt the administrative data. But you were so instrumental. I'm so glad to see you here.
Okay, so I guess if there are no further questions, anyone, we can maybe thank Davina for this very fascinating talk. Lots of challenges, but it's inspiring to also see the advances and the innovations around how you approach measurement. For me, I also thought it was interesting to hear that, obviously you're working on the quant side of things and trying to get the quantitative data, but how important the qualitative information is in all of that. You mentioned so many times the testimonies of victims that provide a lot of input and information to at all think about where to find your sources of information, and that are so important for validation and triangulation. So thanks so much for the talk, and we'll chat with Janina about how to possibly hand on any resources to those who are interested in learning more about your field and the methods that are being used. Thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you guys.
Bye.
Bye everybody.